morning, everybody. Right now, I'm actually at UC Berkeley working on something called Project Climate. So I come at this from a very climate and policy set of lenses, and which is, I think, a little different than a lot of you. So I may have a slightly different approach, which hopefully will raise some possibilities here. And so what I want to talk about is how we might connect more directly the climate issues and plastic issues. And I'll give you a little bit about what I've been working on towards that end. As Marty says, it's more complicated than just oil, but at least from the climate perspective, oil remains the overriding climate issue in connection to plastics. And I'll give you a few more statistics that will tie these two things together. So in 2019, global production and disposal of plastic generated 850 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is about 189 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants worth. Just to give you perspective, California is at about 400 million metric tons annually. So plastics by themselves are over 2 times what California generates in terms of GHG emissions. This is heading up, as Marty and Deanna noted. The expectation is by 2030, it'll be at 1.4 gigatons per year on our current trajectory, and that translates to about 17% of the entire global carbon budget for 2050. So this is where, as Marty said, the oil industry is going in terms of their growth. US petrochemical plants are some of the world's largest GHG emitters. Since 2010, this is a little mind-boggling, and it's probably more now since I wrote this down. Companies have invested more than $200 billion in 333 chemical plants in the US, 88 of which are along the Gulf Coast alone. In 2018 and 2019, petrochemicals accounted for half of the growth of global oil demand. And that's moving up and expected to be more like 70% in the next 10 years. So these are fairly overwhelming implications that we need to make sure that as we reduce oil in the transportation sector, we don't simply move it over to the plastic sector. In the US, plastic is made from natural gas, primarily because of price. If natural gas prices go up and oil is cheaper, it'll be made from oil. It's, you know this better than I, it's refined into ethane, and from there made into plastic. Over 12% of plastics are disposed of, are incinerated, as Deanna just mentioned. Sunlight also breaks down plastic and emits GHGs, and single-use plastic now makes up about 40% of all plastic production. So enough with the numbers, but my point broadly is that this really is a climate change issue. And part of what we have to do, and not all of what we have to do, because there are plenty of other issues with plastics, but we have to move it from oil and petroleum. There are other ways to make plastics, and of course there are many alternatives. So here's one approach that I want to lay out as a possibility that I've been thinking through as a policy matter and potentially as a California matter. through the climate lens and really focusing on the petroleum piece of this. And just to show you how this works, some of you may be familiar with the fact that California has something called a low carbon fuel standard. It's in the, not surprisingly, in transportation fuels. And the way that works is the state sets a carbon intensity number for transportation fuels based on a life cycle analysis. So that includes the production, the transportation, and use. So for example, if you send oil from tar sands in Canada, there's a whole analysis of the GHG emissions resulting from production of that tar sands, transportation from Alberta to California, and then refining of those tar sands. That gets an evaluation and a number. And then that's compared to a baseline that says average carbon intensity in California should be X for transportation fuels. If you exceed that, you have to pay to buy credits. And if you're below the carbon intensity number, then you can generate credits. This has been surprisingly effective and very little, I think, observed, in the sense that it's actually, I just looked it up yesterday, the low carbon fuel standard price for a ton of GHG is $190, making it one of the highest market prices for GHG anywhere in the world. And it's really been effective in, excuse me, generating alternative fuels. In fact, Tesla pretty much survived off of being paid these credits when it was early on as a car company. It's moved away from that, but receiving those credits enabled it to be profitable early on. And of course, the oil companies hate it. So
that's 5 minutes, 5 minutes remaining.
Yeah. We can do something similar for plastics. It's a little different and it's a little more complicated. I actually spent some time when I was first thinking about this talking to Marty, learning a little bit more about how plastics are produced and how we might think about doing this. And so what I've come to is that we can focus on the consumer-facing companies, the companies that use plastics as containers and wrapping and things for their products. Very similar idea where the agency, in this case the Air Resources Board, would set an annual baseline for amount of plastics that come from petroleum, and that reduces over time, creating a cap and trade concept that sets up a credit and debit system. The credits would be carefully defined so that we capture some of the issues that Marty raised around the fact that not all alternatives to plastic, petroleum-based plastics, are necessarily lovely. So there would be a fair amount of effort around defining what alternatives meet the criteria for getting credit. But you would have a declining amount of plastics derived from fossil fuel, and therefore reduce the incentive to get more fossil fuel to make more plastics, breaking that cycle, which is the point of what I'm after. This isn't, in my view, meant to be draconian. I think a lot of consumer-facing companies actually are very interested in having more access to alternatives to petroleum-based plastics. There are a lot of companies, including Google and others, that are spending a fair amount of time and effort in figuring out how to help those markets. But if you have a credit system that works something like the low carbon fuel standard, I think that you start to quickly to promote alternative markets and alternative products and alternative ways to get packaged products and food packaging, et cetera. So I've been working on a way to do it through executive order in California, also through potentially through a bill. And I've gotten a fair amount of interest initially from legislators, but there's this whole virus thing that has slowed down that discussion. So I think I'll stop there.